who, if anyone, should be subsidized, and what form of agriculture is actually the best for the Czech Republic and for the entire European Union. Because at first glance, it seems that there's really a battle here over whether large agribusinesses will dominate, which are efficient, produce food and calories at minimal cost, but on the other hand, don't really have a strong connection to the land. Or whether there will be small and medium-sized farms here, which aren't the most efficient in the world, can't produce calories at such a low cost, but at the same time are better stewards of the landscape, better caretakers of the countryside, and don't siphon profits from rural areas to headquarters in Prague or any other capital city. On the other hand, large agribusinesses are much more capable of withstanding global competition, while small farms practically aren't at all. So are large agribusinesses our inevitable future in the face of competition from South America, Ukraine, or Asia? Or is there another way to do it? If you want to know more, keep watching this video, because we're going to take a closer look at it. From a purely global economic perspective, the argument for large holdings is almost bulletproof. We have big companies in Ukraine, Asia, and South America that are competing very aggressively in our market. Our European market is subsidized, but for example, small farms can't handle those subsidies as efficiently from an economic perspective as large holdings can. Large holdings can perfectly optimize their production. They control everything from the field to the goods on the shelf, and at that point, they minimize costs and maximize both calorie output and economic gains. That makes them much more resilient to global competition from an economic standpoint. Here, it's important to make one crucial point. We can't protect our farmers using tariffs. We can't start subsidizing our agriculture and impose tariffs to protect our agriculture so that competitors can't import their goods here. Because Europe is an industrial country, of course. I mean, area, continent, union, okay? And it needs to export its sophisticated and often expensive products, such as machines or automobiles. And the problem is that many countries put tariff barriers on these products, and those tariff barriers are coming down. For example, right now there are negotiations with Mercosur or with India about lowering tariff barriers. And as a result, we could export far more goods and sell far more goods in their markets. But there's always a condition. They want to sell more agricultural products that are produced in their region here, and by doing so, create competition for our agriculture. So, in order for us to properly sell our industrial production, we have to sacrifice part of our agricultural production. Or at the very least, subject our agricultural sector to brutal competition. Here we come back to those big conglomerates, which are much better able to withstand this kind of competition from their large conglomerates. At the same time, they develop their agriculture much more because they have more money, more fields, more livestock, and more materials on which they can theoretically test some new technologies or new methods. And therefore, these conglomerates are making the biggest advances in agriculture and at the same time are the most resilient from a global perspective. So if we define the ability to produce calories in a specific area at a specific price, ideally the lowest possible one as what food self-sufficiency and independence from food aid and imports mean, then at that moment, large agribusinesses seem to be the best solution for defending against global competition and the potential dependence that could arise if cheap imports were to destroy our own farmers. But there's one problem. Well, actually, there are more problems. This brings us, for example, to Agrofert-style conglomerates. Some of these huge agricultural companies are basically sustained mainly by subsidies. And if they didn't have subsidies, or if those subsidies were significantly reduced, they wouldn't really be able to survive. That means these companies need at least a drastic reform, but they don't go through it because the subsidies keep them afloat. That's one of the negative aspects of these huge agribusinesses, which are run by a single person, but the subsidies keep him afloat, and his inefficient solutions are also kept afloat by them. And so they keep alive even companies that might not necessarily need to exist, and that could be run better if someone a bit more competent took charge there. In other words, the subsidy system and large agribusinesses are able to produce a large amount of calories at relatively low prices, but at the same time, the subsidy system also keeps afloat those large agribusinesses that should either fall apart or undergo reform to function more efficiently, which is a bit of a problem. And this problem becomes even more massive and brutal, and it deepens the inefficiency of those companies, especially if some of their owners manage to secure the position of prime minister and appoint their own people as ministers, like Martin Szybeski, for example. In this case, it's the subsidy system, because the people who receive the subsidies are also the ones deciding who will get them or what the rules will be, and of course, they make sure to benefit themselves more. So instead of working on making their companies more efficient, instead of improving how these companies operate, they prefer to bend the system and rob taxpayers so that these companies are kept alive by taxpayers, even though those companies should have gone bankrupt or reformed a long time ago. The problem is even bigger here with Mr. Sebastian and Andrei Babiš, because since Mr. Sebastian came to the Ministry of Agriculture, certain assessments have changed, which previously stated that Agrofert should not receive some specific subsidies. When Mr. Sebastian came there, suddenly those assessments were changed and suddenly Agrofert was supposed to get those subsidies. What a coincidence that at the moment when Babiš's man came to the ministry, various assessments suddenly came out in favor of Agrofert. Sometimes that's just how things are and you can't change it. However, what's a bit surprising is that these assessments are not public, so we can't comment on them, we can't look at them, and we can't find out what arguments were used for why Agrofert wasn't supposed to receive the subsidies before, but now suddenly can. What other reason could there be except that Sebastian maybe put pressure on some people or something like that? However, this is of course more of a political issue than an agricultural one, but the two are closely connected. It's closely connected to the fact that if this problem continues, the European Union will stop our agricultural subsidies, at least the agricultural ones for Agrofert. That will mean that we'll have to pay these agricultural subsidies from our own state budget, which is already in debt as it is. So Andrei Babiš will be subsidizing his inefficient, dysfunctional company that needs reform with our money so he can keep selling us products that are made inefficiently, are too expensive, and he won't have to do anything about the structure of his companies, which are obviously set up wrong. A lot of people mistakenly see small and medium-sized businesses and small and medium-sized farms as something that's more or less just nice to have, from whom they occasionally buy a few potatoes, but in the end it's not really important where those things actually come from. Yeah, some cows, some chickens, a little field with an old tractor driving around, and sometimes people go there to pick strawberries themselves. Beautiful, yeah, it's nice, but actually it doesn't have that economic value. And it doesn't have the yield that we ultimately want from agriculture, which is calories for the lowest possible price. But here it's important to realize that it has a lot of other advantages, and compared to those big agro-businesses, it's not that much worse off. So for example, a huge advantage of this network is that it's a network, that it's not an authoritarian agro holding, where if one billionaire makes a mistake, it can take down half the agricultural sector in this beautiful Czech Republic. When you have a decentralized network, a lot of people can make a lot of mistakes, and in reality, it doesn't actually cause that much of a problem. At the same time, this decentralized network is more resilient overall. That means if someone wants to, for example, destroy your agriculture, they really have to take a very roundabout approach because there are a lot of people they need to take out, and each of them has a little bit whereas a single agro-holding can be infiltrated, hacked, destroyed in court, and a lot of other things can be done to it. Plus, of course, there are certain inefficiency problems when things are managed poorly, and some agro-holdings are simply managed badly. Besides that, there's also a huge problem in that these big companies manage the land very poorly. Because agriculture is not traditional industry. Agriculture relies on a non-renewable resource called fertile soil. And large agribusinesses that have no relationship to the land use it in their own way, inefficiently. That means they want to achieve the highest possible yields in the short term at the lowest possible cost, but this leads to the degradation of the soil, which in the following years and decades may produce less, so in the end it gives lower yields. And in the end, the management of smaller farms is better than that of larger ones, because the larger ones take very poor care of the land, of that non-renewable resource. Another important and really great thing about smaller farmers is that they are not so dependent on the industrialization of agriculture. In other words, very often they can get by with their own fertilizer, which comes from their livestock, for example. Of course, it's not as efficient and so on, but while large agribusinesses are optimized and handle fertilization only with chemicals, the smaller farmer can adapt more quickly. And when there's not as much fertilizer needed from gas, ammonia, and whatever else, they can use natural fertilization much better, if I put it that way. Whereas the large agribusiness can't adapt so flexibly because everything is contracted, planned, and strictly set. The people who run those specific branches aren't the owners of those branches. They're just managers and have to listen to higher level managers. Whereas in smaller businesses, the people who run specific farms and branches are actually the owners, so they can respond much more quickly, more actively, and more proactively to all those problems. Actually, you can look at it a bit like the army. When you have an army where the command is based on lower-ranking officers, that army often works much better because those lower-ranking officers have a lot of authority, they can make decisions, they can act, and they don't have to wait for what the one centralized boss will say. When you have a centralized army like this, one that doesn't trust lower-ranking officers and where all the decisions are made by generals, it often works very inefficiently, and that leads to huge losses. And it's quite similar in agriculture if we're talking about small and medium-sized businesses versus large agribusinesses. Yeah, but what are we going to do about the huge problem of those massive agribusinesses from South America, Asia, or Ukraine, which clearly have a huge capital advantage over the small ones? And even those huge European companies can take over the small ones. How can they protect themselves from being bought out, exploited, or destroyed by someone? Well, the solution could be a word that everyone here is a bit wary of because of its past, and that's agricultural cooperatives. Agricultural cooperatives, which are of course voluntary, come together and function as a kind of alliance of small and medium-sized farmers. That means they have the flexibility of small and medium-sized farmers, the resilience of a network built on small and medium-sized farms, but at the same time, they can have the capital of a large agribusiness. If they join together and if they agree on joint investments and joint procedures, this is something that has and can have enormous value when there isn't top-down management, but there are real people making decisions about their own specific farms, big or small. And when, for example, there's a need to do a big project like building something or buying some equipment, they pool their resources together, buy the equipment and say, so from now on, this equipment belongs to all of us. Anyone who needs it can simply take it and use it on their own fields. In this way, small and medium-sized farmers can resist global competition and at the same time operate much more efficiently than centrally managed agribusiness conglomerates like Agrofert, which would probably go bankrupt without subsidies. I'm not saying that the small farmers would live wonderfully and perfectly without subsidies, but it's more about how important subsidies are for the operation of those specific farms. And at the moment when you can't do anything at all without subsidies, then it's just a disaster. And at the moment when you need a huge amount of subsidies, then it's even more of a disaster. The smaller and medium-sized companies, of course, need a lot of subsidies, but many of them would be able to operate even without them, or they don't need such a high amount of subsidies because they operate much more efficiently in a more decentralized way, and they create systemic resilience. In the end, when we think and talk about it like this, it's really about the fact that the best is a combination of a few large agro holdings, which will actually create the backbone of the network, and alongside them a huge number of various cooperatives and smaller farms, which will provide an alternative and strengthen the systemic resilience of our agriculture. What is definitely an endangered species are small independent farms. That's something that doesn't really bring any economic efficiency at all. And if a farmer is just farming on his own little field, taking subsidies for it, doing it very inefficiently and so on, not joining any cooperatives, and at the same time not being part of any holding, well, good for him, he's probably a really nice person. But on the other hand, when it comes to calorie efficiency, energy use, or land management efficiency, or the ability to withstand various global players, well, God bless him, I hope he manages. But personally, I don't think it's a good approach. But I'm not a farmer. I look at this whole issue more from the perspective of geopolitics, subsidies, politics, the country, and economics, not from the perspective of just growing grain. So the fact that I'm not a farmer isn't really a problem in this regard at the moment when I'm not looking at it from the farmer's perspective, but from the perspective of economics and politics. So that's it. Hey, tell me in the comments what you think about it, whether you're more of a fan of agricultural cooperatives or more of a fan of big authoritarian agro holdings, or if you're naive and think it can work without cooperatives, with small and medium-sized businesses that are independent of each other. So, are you realists about decentralization, realists about centralization, or are you naive idealists about the beauty of decentralization? Let me know, support the content, write your opinions, share the video. In this regard, I would really like to start a civil discussion because I am fully aware that I might not have said everything completely correctly here, and I think it would be good to clarify much more about the specific advantages and disadvantages. I just mentioned some advantages, disadvantages, and problems that came to my mind and which I logically considered and worked with. Now I would need and appreciate your help with arguments. So that's it. Please keep the conversation polite and share this video. Support the content, take care, and see you later.